Morning, Chris. Hi.
But before we talk about the detail in this announcement, speaking to Max Mariner and others over the past day or so, hearing talk of this NATO forecast of a possible Russian attack by 2030, that will alarm a lot of people. How real do you think it is? How much is this the talk in Westminster?
Well, that's based on a NATO assessment, and we already have a war in Europe. We've had a war in Europe running for over 3 years now with the illegal invasion of Ukraine. So we've seen Russia's intent towards its near neighbours, and that's why Poland and the Baltic states, who are closest to Russia, have significantly increased their defence spending, and we are lagging behind them. And sadly, what we saw yesterday, I think from the comments you've had from a general and a brigadier, was that this is too little too late, and it's well below the amount that the military have said is needed if we're going to, importantly, deter the threat of that potential attack in 2030.
So in what way do you feel it doesn't go far enough? What more was needed?
Well, it's a £15 billion extra package, of which we then discover a third of that, nearly £5 billion, is not even funded. And there's also around £10 billion of efficiency savings to be made by the Ministry of Defence. There's always going to be uncertainty whether those are going to be delivered. So this isn't a fully funded plan, and it's taken over a year since the Strategic Defence Review, which set out the threats and the capabilities that we needed. And the government's come forward in the dying days of Keir Starmer's government with a plan which doesn't meet the moment. And it also delays upgrades to things like military homes, which will be of concern to all of our service personnel in the region.
Of course, these things are very complex, though, aren't they? And if you are going to increase the defence budget, it has to come from somewhere else. And that can often mean people who've been relying on big infrastructure projects or government investment in other areas, but being let down. And as you know from the Conservatives being in government for so long, that isn't something that people take kindly, is it? When they have funds that they thought they were promised taken away from them.
No, we've already seen that in this Parliament, where we've seen Ely Junction and upgrades to the A47 have been cancelled by the government. But importantly, in the funding that's been moved around from the Transport Department or the Energy Department, there's not a penny of savings from the welfare budget to fund defence. Sickness benefits are set to rise to £100 billion a year by the end of this Parliament from about £60 billion. The government has shied away from making any welfare savings whatsoever. If they'd done that, if they'd followed what we've identified around £23 billion worth of savings, then they could be having a fully funded plan that actually meets the demands that the military have set. Instead, the Prime Minister has essentially left a big black hole for Andy Burnham, presumably, to pick up. But we don't really know what Andy Burnham thinks, because he's never said anything about defence, and he hasn't said anything about defence since he became the putative Prime Minister. So it is worrying that we have got a plan that isn't actually baked in terms of the numbers and the funding that's needed. We need certainty at this point so that we can get on with the welcome investments that have been referred to in terms of drone and AI and other technologies, and make it a more agile defence. But that will only work, and industry will only respond if they're confident that the funding is actually there.
And I know it's not quite in your constituency, but we've got RAF Marham in Norfolk, and there are a lot of people who rely on places like that and rely on certainty as to what the plan is.
Yeah, and I was at an event at Marham yesterday, as it happened, and I think there's excitement about more investment into the F-35 programme, the Lightning programme, and that could lead to a third squadron being stood up with the A variant, which will give us a nuclear capability for the RAF for the first time for some time. So that is welcome. And they were talking about some of the upgrades that have just been completed to accommodation. But the next phases of the improvements depend on the funding being available. So I'm concerned that around £300 million is being reduced from what was due to be spent in this Parliament on the homes for our armed forces as part of these plans. So that is a worry. And looking more to the future, they're also delaying some of the boost to capacity to our cadet units, which is an important part of creating a pipeline for people and also part of our national resilience. So the headline of this is a £15 billion investment, I'm afraid sadly doesn't reflect the reality. and the Prime Minister's come forward with something that is essentially half-baked and will probably have to be returned to by Andy Burnham, certainly will be, to find that £5 billion which has not been identified in the package that's been announced.
James Wild, North West Norfolk MP, Conservative MP, thank you.